This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, I'm speaking to a very special guest, the founder and CEO of Dum-Dums and Dragons, Ryan LaPlante. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very pleased to be here.
So I want to kick things off just by asking, how did you first come into contact with TTRPGs? Like, how did you get started in the hobby?
I started late in life. I had heard about it vaguely. I think I had a lot of people's experience was one not great night in college where you play D&D with people you don't know very well and everybody's trying to win, and I just did not know what was going on. And then I'd escaped it for a while, not through anything active. I just kind of hadn't stumbled back into the right table, I would say now, until I started hearing podcasts with comedians playing. I think I heard some of Harmontown. I heard some other groups, and I was like, oh, this is just a storytelling medium where you get to roll dice to decide whether you succeed or not, so you don't just yes and forever. And I was like, I want to do this. Because I'd gone through the Second City Improv Conservatory in Toronto. I had a bunch of comedian and improviser friends. So then I put out a post looking for a DM, and a friend from college messaged me and was like, I have been trying to quit D&D. It takes up all of my time. I was finally like, I cannot have another table dissolve. And I was like, Tom, we got a great setup. If it's a show, no one will quit because it'll be a show. And he signed on. So my first game of D&D is the first episode of Dum-Dums and Dragons.
Yeah, that's actually a story I've heard a little bit. Dragon Mind is part of what's called the Darkmoor Podcast Network, and those are other actual play shows that have a similar story where it was groups that wanted to commit to this as a hobby. They saw the value in it, and by having it be a little bit more formalized in a show, it helped everyone continue with it much longer than a lot of casual games do. Now, I know that you mentioned that you saw that it was like a storytelling medium with dice determining the outcome. Is there something in particular that you love about TTRPGs that you don't get through other storytelling mediums?
I think I love it for kind of two different reasons, because I am the rare switch. I play a bunch of games as a player, and I DM and GM and storytell and other things. As a player, I love the level of immersion and agency you get compared to any other kind of gaming. Traditional video games, like, they can be incredible. Baldur's Gate 3 is like probably, right now the gold standard of what can happen, or Mass Effect. But you still, not that you necessarily want to, but you can't walk into the bar and necessarily get a great quest out of every single person you're going to meet. You aren't necessarily going to be able to deep dive on somebody's backstory. You don't necessarily get to bring all of the things you want to it and have the fun of like your own voice performance and choosing the exact words you're saying, and the spontaneity and collaboration, also the shared storytelling with other people, I really, really love. Is I don't just have a character who's affected by the DM. I'm affected equally by however many other people are at the table, and we're all shaping each other. So I love the collaboration. And as a DM, GM, insert title of system here, I spent a lot of time narrative designing for video games. So I started as like actor, then did director, then did screenwriting for 10 years, and then did about 5 years of video game narrative design. Doing like DMing gives me the chance to get to do something big and sprawling and explore every part of it that's interesting to the person playing it in a way that if I had to write out all of the single options they could have is completely ruinous. So it lights up my brain in all the ways instead of just a few.
Is there a role that you prefer between being a player or a DM?
Oh, that is, I think, the trickiest question ever. If I am at the right table with the right DM, I love playing, because I think I can do some cool stuff because I've got a real story brain, and if I build the right character, I can have fun supporting their story, challenging other people to have cool moments and find those myself. But DMing sure is fun. I think the only reason I don't instantly say DMing is the prep work. If I have to do no prep as a player and just get to show up, I'm like, this is the best.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned that you've been in the improv comedy world for a while, which is also really interesting because, I listened to the first episode of Dum-Dums and Dragons, and then I immediately listened to the first episode of Jesters of Ravenloft. And Jesters of Ravenloft actually had me cracking up just a little bit more, especially when you had the players roll up stats for each other. But it's interesting how even from a comedy standpoint, you chose a horror setting. So what made you attracted to Ravenloft and trying to combine that comedy horror genres?
Yeah, so Jesters of Ravenloft is the first D&D podcast I like kind of D&D game I have run on the regular. I bought a bunch of source books and I went on vacation and then promptly forgot everything I was doing on vacation and just read D&D source books as we're all prone to doing. And Ravenloft, I love horror movies. I've produced horror movies, I directed horror movies. I did a bunch of time on the independent kind of horror circuit. And I've always loved horror and comedy. I think they're a natural blend because you get the relief. You get the comedy to let yourself laugh and have a breath and have the table breathe and have fun with it. And then you can lean right back into the horror, and it means you can maximize your horror because people don't get tired. It's like if you're playing a tense horror video game and you're like, oh, they could come around the corner any second. Oh, they could come around the corner any second. And you can only maintain that level of stress for like 2 hours before you're like, all right, I guess it's this corner. I don't know, man. It's going to be what it is. But if you've got the comedy, you can play back and forth. And I'd read the Ravenloft book, and I was like, oh, the domains are so creepy, and there's so much fun here. And then I was trying to think of what would work for a podcast, because sometimes that could be a little different than what would work for a table, but I usually try to find the blend of both. I was like, oh, I can ambush my friends. They won't even know. And so for the first episode, all I did was I told all the players beforehand that I had great characters for them, so they didn't need to build anything. If they showed up, they were really going to love these characters. So the show starts, as you've heard if you listen to the first episode, I'm like, let's just do a warm-up game. You know, we'll get the improv juices flowing. The four of you are a sketch troupe. Let's put on the final sketch of your big show. And then at the end of the sketch, they get sucked into the Ravenloft through the mists, and they build each other's stats. And I just wanted to see normal people in the nightmare setting reacting to it, but I also thought it would just be a lot of fun knowing the very goofy comedian friends that I have, to be like, let's see how real they get and let's see how insane they get. And it ranges from people having psychological breakdowns as the show goes on to one guy who just becomes a Saturday morning cartoon villain, and it turns out he has multiple personalities. So, you know, even within the party, we really went real and goofy, but it's led to some really cool and exciting drama and stuff like that. So for me, it's horror is just a great way to, as long as you play within the safety tools of talking to people, what's too horrifying. We know it's a comedy, so there's a cap on exactly how dark we're going to go. But it lets people really have those cathartic releases of the big scares, the big feels in a safe and fun way, which I'm like, that's the purpose of horror.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's almost like the perfect example of something that's even mentioned in Curse of Strahd, like right away. Like they say you can't go too dark all the time or else it becomes too monotone. They even mention, you know, having some lighter moments or moments of hope just to create a little bit more variance in the emotional experience of the players. One thing I'm really curious about, because especially since COVID, there's been a lot of talk about properly setting expectations in safety tools in the TTRPG space because I don't know about you, but I've always found that TTRPGs tend to feel a lot more intimate storytelling wise than a lot of other creative mediums. So how do you balance setting expectations, boundaries, veils, and lines with having that surprise element that keeps everyone on their toes?
Yeah, I think the thing for me is setting expectations up front. I have some advantages in that we've run a bunch of shows. It's generally with people we know, but we also like produce one shots with players we know nothing about. And it's, for us, it's kind of acknowledging what's on the table and what's off the table and constantly checking in between episodes and making sure things are okay. Horror, I was like, what's too spooky? What's the thing that, like, for people, and somebody even told me, I think 8 episodes in to Jesters of Ravenloft, where there was supposed to be like a whole spider realm, and they're like, I forgot to say, but spiders are too much for me. And I was like, I totally understand, that's totally reasonable. And then they said that to me off air, and on air, all of a sudden, all the mists, I guess something happened and it changed, and now it's all lizard people. Who knew? How did that happen? It was just, we need to take spiders off the table. But I also try to check in, and it's some rules, because Ravenloft can be tricky. If you look at a lot of the online guides, like if you're going to join a random game with a random DM you do not know, Ravenloft is a red flag, just as an immediate statement. But for me, it's like I try to make sure players always have consent. If it's a cursed item, they're the one playing how the cursed item plays out. Charm and things like that, I tend to not use for like you fall in love with the villain arcs unless the player wants to present that. We don't do sexual violence. We don't do domestic violence. A running joke that popped up on the show was, I said, like, nothing bad is going to happen to anybody under the age of 18. So when somebody like adopted a daughter who was like 17 in town, they're like, haha, she can't die. And then I was like, oh, it's her birthday and she turned 18, so they would know what was going on. But I think it's just, and also really just checking in at the table. Like I'll check in with stuff that's going on. I want the players to be having fun. I don't necessarily know what the audience is going to like or not like in podcast world, but I'm tracking with the players. And like, when are they engaged? When are they leaning in? When are they shocked? And if they're starting to drift, it's like, okay, we want to bring it back. But I think the tricky thing with horror and TTRPGs is just the level of immersion, because you are your character. So it's kind of, for me, I look at it and I'm like, what's the haunted house or haunted maze version of horror where you can absolutely creep out and horrify people, but not at the point of what happens to them will haunt them later. You don't want you don't want to like walk somebody through an experience they would never want to have in real life, even as an actor, and trick them into like that happening. Unless somebody says they specifically want to explore it, and then I don't know, man. There's a table for everything. Have the weirdest game you want to have. But yeah, that's kind of where I draw the line.
Do you have a specific example of that kind of haunted house feel where you got them to have a cathartic moment, but didn't have it be like, I don't know, for a lack of a better term, overly traumatic, where they're feeling like it's haunting them past the experience of the game?
Yeah. So we went pretty dark at the beginning of Canada by Night. So it's Vampire the Masquerade. So it's innately a darker world. Everyone is kind of a vampire, and we had a character who was kind of didn't want to have become a vampire and had been forced to become one. Long story short, they're the vampire police department of a small town where vampires and humans are co-mingling. They decided to come out of the coffin. It's a secret little experiment, but then things have gone wrong, and now these vampires are trying to protect this town. And she was captured by this like evil cult of vampires and went through like interrogations where she was like fed blood and tied to a chair. And it was easier to do safely because the performer playing this was my wife. And then the big battle after that was a bunch of people who had been possessed running into this combat, and our heroes trying to protect the town council against people who were significant to them. And it got very high stakes and very risky. One character, like one player, tore another player's arm off. It was there were some crazy die rolls in Vampire World. But for me, it was making sure that she wasn't experiencing a lot of physical violence as a character. It was like, oh, you're tied to the chair and it's psychologically creepy. Blood is innately creepy, but it's a vampire show, so you're going to be kind of comfortable with that. And like a beaded villain with a veil over their face, standing over monologuing and knowing that people are dying, but you're not necessarily seeing the deaths depending on how it's vibing. And then going into the combat, it was like the danger, rather than trying to be like, oh, this bad thing is happening to you as players, it was putting them in the middle of, the bad guys are actually attacking the town council. Can you stop those bad guys? And it enhanced the horror, because it was like, oh, we're watching people's loved ones attack them, but it's not our players' loved ones attacking our players. You're seeing it from the side, and can you stop it? And you're very active in the scenario. So you can amp this kind of the stakes and the horror of it without having to walk down too dark a path. And we check in between, like our episodes usually run about 45 to 60, and they are pretty strictly, that's our length. We check in between any episodes where that's happening, being like, is this cool? Or sometimes we do it and we keep them on air, and sometimes we do that and we just remove them from the podcast. But I try to be really, really communicative so that they can get the stuff that's like, ooh, that was gnarly. And we've had some, I ran some ultra dark stuff that was designed to be like, oh, we're going into the Warhammer 40,000 universe, which is already grimdark sci-fi. And I was like, and we're doing a villain campaign where you play members of the Blood Pact and you've been captured by a Night Lord, which is like the Space Marine Legion known for torture and other spooky things. And I was like, dear listeners, this will not be a comedy. We are going into a very dark town. And the nice thing was, because it was that way, a bunch of people were able to, if they wanted to try it out for a couple of minutes, and if they get to a scene and be like, nah, it's too intense, I'm out. But the players were like, oh, we're going for it. All right, let's lean in. Again, setting those expectations of being like, here's the kind of movies I would compare where I want to take this horror to. Here's the limits that I'm going to draw, so you don't have to ever wonder. And I think that's a big thing, which is being like, we're not going to explore A, B, C, D, E, F, G. This will never appear. And then you can have those scenes where people can kind of explore the ideas and really immerse themselves in the horror, but they don't have to worry about it stepping too far into any of those uncomfortable directions.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Just demonstrating the stakes of a situation by making it kind of impersonal, by watching what could happen, but not directly affecting the characters. Like, it reminds me of the first time I watched Hellsing Ultimate, and London gets attacked, and you see all this like grisly violence and stuff. So there's an understanding of what the stakes are, but when it comes to like the main characters, they aren't like directly connected to any of it. That's really good advice.
Unless
So
you want to pick that, and then you can also structure scenes where you're like, oh, this person's personal thing is being threatened. This person's best friend is at the core of this horrifying thing, but they have three people who may not be as emotionally invested in this exact conflict who can then support the scene, support the plot, and be there. Because when you can focus in on one and you know it's something they're comfortable with being more horrified about, then you've got a whole group that can kind of support it, keep it flowing, match the tone.
So for this next question, you don't have to get too specific. This is more just a curiosity. I know a lot of times when you see like horror stories on Reddit, usually there's almost this accusational approach of if something went wrong, it's on the DM for not having talked about it ahead of time, and there are situations where a player doesn't know how much they'll be emotionally affected until it happens. So an example was I remember Brennan Lee Mulligan talking about on Adventuring Academy. His guest was talking about there was a scene with a centipede, and centipede wasn't something where they were like, that's like a boundary for me. But just the way the DM described it tended to hit a little home in a way the player wasn't expecting up front until it was kind of in the moment. Have you experienced a situation like that, and how did you navigate it?
Yeah, I think we've experienced situations like that in a couple of ways. We had somebody while we were recording, we were going through, and we have some kind of like, as I've said, we're improv heavy shows. And it was like a character. Some of our characters, like players, play multiple people. We have a couple of weird townsfolk where like it may have been an episode where their player wasn't involved, their central character, but they go to like a weird grocery store, and I'm like, perfect, they can be the grocer. I'll just let them be a weird NPC. And we have these moments where you're like, oh, I need to call back this grocer now. Oops, now you're going to have to do more scenes with yourself, or I need this grocer or mayor or radio host or whoever for a scene that's going on. And I brought somebody into the scene where I was like, and this NPC shows up, played by this person, and here's what you're doing in the scene, here's what you know. And then the scene started, and this player, again, through no fault of their own, but they just started to have a panic attack. And we realized after like 3 questions into the scene, it was like, oh, this player doesn't fully understand the way I tried to pitch this new NPC joining the scene. They don't know what they're supposed to do. They feel like they're letting me down. They feel like they're just making wrong choices. And then we were like, we ended up taking a break. And they went and kind of had a moment to calm down. And I think it took a Xanax. Medication can be the right thing at times for what you need. And then they came back, and I was like, do you know what? Let's restart this scene from you guys walking into this space. I won't need this NPC for this scene. I've got another way to do this. And it's something that's really worked for us when we've had those moments of like, just call a pause. Even like podcasts, even on the recordings, we do it, but you can absolutely do this at the table and be like, okay, let's stop. This is feeling weird. How's everybody doing? Let people emotionally regulate themselves and talk through the solution. Should we start this scene over and have it be like a floating skull that doesn't touch you? Like, would that be fine? Do you want to do this scene? Would you rather that you don't have to interact with this thing and the centipede can crawl on somebody else? Like, what is the solution for the group? It doesn't mean you have to like break the story unless the story is the issue and then figure that one out. Well, they're all the examples, but I think it's just restarting scenes to make them safe and friendly because it is a collaboration. What's the version of this that's exciting for them and good for you? And you may have to pump the brakes, especially if somebody's found themselves like getting pushed higher. You're like, go so soft as a DM, like tone the horror back to like getting someone comfortable at the table again. Like, you abandon horror. Maybe the centipede's like, hey man, what's going on? Like, just start it, like shift it completely in terms of tone, but free people up from that so that they can re-immerse themselves, feel safe moving forwards. At least that's kind of what we've done.
I think that's awesome advice. I think it does a lot of good to almost give, especially new game masters, permission to pump the brakes, like you said. I've been at tables before where, for whatever reason, the group, their justification is that they want to preserve the integrity of what happened, and it ends up being detrimental to a player's experience or even the story as a whole. as a result of it being a detriment to the player's experience. So to have someone, as prolific as you, give that advice, I think carries a lot of weight. Now, speaking of just mistakes, just this might be a hard topic shift, but what do you think is the
Let's take a hard left. I love it.
yeah? What do you think is the biggest mistake that first-time players make when building their first character?
That's a great question. And it's one that we've featured a lot. And I experienced this in that one day, barely played at college game. But I think a lot of people start off trying to create their character and they create the hero of a movie. They create John Wick. And they're like, he's John Wick. He lost his dog. He has no family. He has no friends. No one likes him. He's a super murderer, and he's the best there ever was. It's the classic, like, they were like a slave in the gladiator pits, and they lost their family, and now they're out for justice, which is impossible to play as a level 1 character because you're not John Wick quality in terms of combat. And the other challenge is those characters don't have anyone they care about or any reason to be involved in quests, and they tend to be loners who don't like to talk a lot. It's very, very challenging to play and engage and have fun with those characters at the table as the DM or as other players or as anything. And you can watch players get themselves stuck where they're like, oh, well, he wouldn't say anything. And you're like, okay, have fun at this bar scene that we're doing for the next 2 hours. You can sit in the corner. I think the piece of advice I have for anybody building characters for a campaign where you're starting at level 1, if you're starting at level 15, have fun. Do whatever you want. You're going to be nearly a god. It's going to be incredible. But if you're starting at level 1, think back and go, okay, I'm not John Wick at the John Wick movies. I'm John Wick just after he graduated from the Assassin Academy, or maybe just before he got a job at the Mafia. Like, he's been a Mafia guy for a year. He drives a car for someone important. Now he's striking out on his own. Leave them room to learn. Room to grow. They're at the start of a journey, whatever that journey is. They can still have bold things. They've got their own backgrounds. They have their own pieces moving forwards. They're something more than just a regular townsfolk, but leave a lot of room to grow. And the other thing is, I love Vampire the Masquerade for this term, touchstones. Vampire the Masquerade, when you design your character, you have touchstones who are people who are important to you that exemplify part of your beliefs. So you could choose your kind of guiding beliefs, and for each belief that you have as a vampire slash character, there is one person who exemplifies that belief who in your life you protect and care about. And if something bad happens to them, it affects you statistically, and it changes your beliefs. And I love doing that. Starting a character and being like, who is your best friend? Who is your worst enemy? Who is a person that you know through like work that you like? And who is a random person in the world that you've always got along with or are familiar with? And pulling those names as a DM, I'm like, oh, all of a sudden if I've got 4 players, I've got 16 story hooks where they will go after their rival, they will protect their friend, they will do these things. A really bold choice in D&D is to have a family you like. Every guest showed up, I think, for a year for us, and they were like, I hate my dad, all in a row, which is the perfect stand-up comedy bit. It's like, oh no, we got comedians, they all hate their dads, cool.
That is really funny. Yeah, actually, that's a boundary in some of my games. I've had players come up and be like, I want a happy family. I need to know as one of my boundaries that you're not going to use them as a plot device to hurt my character. So it's just kind of interesting how sometimes the whole like, oh, my family was killed in a fire thing, it's because they don't want to get hurt emotionally. Which the touchstones thing just kind of reminded me of this. So the tagline to this podcast is discovering your best self through gaming. And the reason that's the tagline is I've had multiple players over the years tell me that the characters they create in various TTRPGs feel like touchstones for their real world persona. So it's them but magnified through a specific lens. So if it's say a D&D, it's a bard, it's their ability to be silly, or maybe if they're more serious in real life, they're experimenting with what it's like to be silly in like a safe imaginary space. Or maybe if they're playing a wizard, it's learning how to be organized or think through a decision instead of being impulsive. Have you experienced playing a character like that that's like a touchstone for you? Or as a GM, seen that happen with another player you've played with?
Yes and yes. I think there's no way to improvise a full character that you've created and not have it be part of you. That's just That's the ground up. If you're really there and you're in the moment and the first thought is coming out of you, classic improv like first thought, Beth's thought, it's going to be you thinking. You're secretly the brain behind every character. I have some pretty strong filters that I put on that to focus in. But no, I love them all. I'm not a tattoo guy. Needles, like I will just pass out instantly. But if I were, I would probably have every one of my major characters down my arm because they're all me. They're all part of it. I love all these weird, dumb babies that I've made. Some of them just straight up murderers. But like being able to explore that, I think is so important. Deborah Ann Wool did an interview with John Bernthal where she talked about loving D&D because it's your chance to like learn how to become a hero yourself. You get to role play being a hero and practice to carry it over. But players I've seen, and it depends. Some people play characters that they think are so outlandishly far from themselves, and then you watch it slowly get walked back closer and closer to them as more real emotions sink in. And some people play characters that are really close to themselves right up front. And I mean, I've learned lessons. I've cried playing D&D a bunch of times, several of them on air. I've experienced tremendously tragic loss through D&D, which is really funny for you and a friend who played a character for that character to die, and then for you and that friend to sit there and cry and mourn this fictional third person that neither of you will get to hang out with again. It's a real life generator, and I think it's such a powerful thing to be able to do that and to be able to step in and to be able to care that much. And it's why I think there is a bit of a sacred trust as a DM or GM to take care of the people playing the game and to make sure like there are people who rules is written in every table is correct. However you want to run D&D, you're right. I tend to lean into the narrative aspects of it, and it's one of those things for me where I've generally talked with my players and I'm like, you will not be killed randomly due to a bad die roll in a scene that is uninteresting. If you die, and you can die whenever we need, but it's going to be impactful to the story, to the other characters, and to you. I'm not interested in 5 rabid squirrels come out of the woods. Oops, 2 of them rolled nat 20s. You rolled a 1 on a death save. Your character dies. The story is over. You were saving a kingdom, and you're an incredible hero with 3 important friends. That squirrel got you due to, statistics are bad sometimes. And I totally understand where tables, that's true, all that kind of stuff. It's just not going to be my table, probably. And the trick for me, and it's the trick from screenwriting and other things, is to create the illusion that the squirrels could absolutely kill you. And if you're a DM or GM at home and you're not sure how to do that, the trick is to make NPCs less safe. The people, like, put the characters they like and love at risk. Have them have to protect somebody else who isn't them. It creates the stakes because they may be kind of aware that they're probably more likely to get resurrected than the average person. That NPC isn't. And that if that NPC goes that they're protecting and really love, Mr. Blorpelkins might not make it this mission. And you can get him to cry over a goblin. It's possible. But no, I think it's really a way to walk through your own life. And the other thing I would say for DMs to keep in mind is if somebody is playing themselves in a game, not in a like Jesters of Ravenloft, they know they're playing themselves, it's a comedy. But if they're coming in, a lot of people's first characters are super, super close to who they are. And I think those are the moments to consciously go like, I'm not going to introduce the like mean bard who's really going to go after this character's flaws because it's really easy to drift into. And now I introduce a character where I, as the DM, will insult you as a person. Just you, the player who is my friend at this table, because saying this about your character is also in some way saying this about you. It's a fine line, but I think you can really set people up to tackle the things they want to tackle and to be challenged by the things they want to be challenged by. And I think that's really the power of the medium.
So you've mentioned a few different TTRPGs now, like Vampire the Masquerade. I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about is mostly like 5th edition. What's like the breadth of different TTRPG systems you've had experience with?
Yeah, so we have, under our kind of Dum Dums and Dice banner, we have 10 different shows, and we've played a ton. We've had Star Wars Edge of the Empire, which I'm pretty sure is Genesis-based. It's been a while since I played that one, but that was there. We played, I think, 3 different Genesis versions of things, which can be very complicated, but is a really rewarding narrative system once you get past the hurdle of how the dice work. We played a Warhammer 40,000 Genesis adaptation. We have played Wrath and Glory, which is one of the official Warhammer 40K games. Pulp Cthulhu we played. We debated about doing a full Call of Cthulhu, but the characters were a little prone to going insane or dying instantly, which makes it harder to tell a long-term story for a podcast. We've Vampire the Masquerade has popped up. We've played Pick Me, Trophy, Monster of the Week. We've played a lot. The only systems we tend to avoid just because we're in podcast land is anything super rules crunchy. We haven't stepped into Pathfinder. We haven't stepped into anything where we would have to track encumbrance. We've just learned that entire episodes trying to math out how to take off and put on your armor before bed. But like, okay, I've got combat, but I need 4 minutes to put on my plate mail. Or, oh no, my backpack's too heavy. It was just they're great games. They just didn't work for us on air. But no, those are kind of the big standouts for me.
So I know it might be trying to pick your favorite child, but of all the games you've played, is there one that stands out as the one you like the best, either to play or to run?
I would probably say Dungeons and Dragons. It's really, really solid. I've run a bunch of games, and the thing I like is how fast the die roll can get put together and how impactful. There's stuff that I've stolen from other systems. I've borrowed touchstones from Vampire the Masquerade. I have occasionally borrowed the idea of like more intense crit fail and success results because it's been fun in Vampire. But what I love about D&D is roll this exact stat, it's there. Okay, this is what you see. Because it means that the gap between the question and back to story in terms of mechanic is so short. It's so easy to just move forwards. And the action economy in combat is so consistent that we end up bringing it over to other systems anyways. Technically, in Vampire the Masquerade, rules is written, combat happens all at the same time. They acknowledge in the system, they're like, this is not designed for long combats. Do 3 rounds and get out. It's 3 and out is the general rule. And if you watch the official Vampire the Masquerade podcast, it's very funny to watch combat, and sometimes immediately after 3 rounds when it maybe should go a little longer. But we just put initiative order in place. Because I'm like, tracking, okay, everybody say your actions at the same time. Okay, gunshots happen first, then other people run, and it's all competing rolls. It's like, no, just roll the initiative. Okay, you go, then you go, then you go, then you go. And the descriptions of like bonus actions and reactions, attacks of opportunity, they're so clear in what they are and what they say they are that every other system will like delete whatever term they're using here. This is a reaction. We know what a reaction is. And I love that so much. So D&D as a player, fantastic. I haven't really got into the wizard realm, prepared spells. We have too much FOMO in our team, so we've all just kind of been like, you have all the spells. You know your spells, you're fine. Whatever you want to use on any given day, you can have. It's too fun, and don't abuse it. But no, it's so much fun. I mean, I'm a cleric main personally, but there's a lot of good stuff out there.
Moodhammer! Like, oh man, when I was first listening to Moodhammer, I was dying in my car. It was actually a little dangerous how hard I was laughing while trying to merge. But yeah, it's interesting you're talking about the speed of 5e because especially with the playtest, that's been like a major criticism is that with all the new rules, there's like this fear of the game slowing down. Have you taken a look at D&D 2024?
I have not had a chance to jump into 2024. In a weird turn of fate, I got the advanced book from Gen Con from one of our listeners who mailed it to me. So I had it like 2 weeks early, and then just life took over, and I couldn't get into it. I am excited to check it out. The thing for me, though, and it's the thing I would suggest to anybody, is I'm like, keep the stuff you like and ditch the stuff you don't. Like, we're not. These rule books are at best suggestions. They're all living rule books where we will get errata, we will get new source books. It will be unbalanced. But the thing is, this isn't a competitive game. We're not all going to like the Dungeons and Dragons tournament. We're like, haha, I got you. A sorcerer can do this now. You lose. It's not Magic the Gathering. So if you like the old Paladin rules, keep them. Like we change stuff all the time to just be like, oh, we like this. Oh, we don't like this. Like I play the cleric of Moonhammer. We all love Butthole Farch. He named himself. I'm sorry about the name. Weirdly enough, after about 5 episodes, you'll start saying it casually, and you'll really get yourself in trouble in public areas. But we played him as a cleric, like a traditional cleric of life, and then we're like, this doesn't feel quite where he should be sitting in the story. And then he had a crisis of faith, and we were like, oh, he lost his powers, and he became an atheist. I'm going to spoil a little bit here. But it was like, okay, what do we do mechanically for that? Is he just a fighter now? Like, he uses a warhammer. What is it? And I talked with my friend Tom, who was the DM, and it was like, oh, no, let's take all of his cleric abilities that he could theoretically have as a cleric of war, so it's all combat related, and let's flavor it all as physical things he can do so there's no magic involved in any of it. So he has like a Captain America shield on a chain that he can throw to hit people with for spiritual weapon on top of his weapon in the other hand, things like that. And then we came like, I'm not going to go into how, but like all of a sudden there's a cleric in the show who had his cleric powers again. But we were like, oh, it doesn't feel right for him to be the full cleric of life because he's a little punchier. We wanted that. So we were like, okay, he'll keep some of his cleric of war abilities and we will strike any ranged healing. So Butthole has not used any ranged healing that does not require touch since like the second season. We just took all those spells off the spell list and we're like, okay, have this, but this is gone. Because then, oh, he's got to be right in the middle of it to be useful at all. But I don't know. Have you seen the new 2024 book? How is it? What should I be worried about?
So I don't know if you need to be worried about anything, which was kind of what I was leaning toward. Because I did try Pathfinder Second Edition when the whole OGL thing happened.
Oh, yeah.
Like a lot of people, I was really angry. So we tried it and it was way too crunchy. Like you were spot on with the fact that the math of the game and the system was getting in the way of what we wanted to do with our narrative. Personally, I love 2024. I think that there are some things that I'm like about, but overall in terms of presentation and accessibility, they like nailed their goal, I think, of being basically any new TTRPG player's first stop into opening up the hobby. Like it's general enough, it's easy enough for most people to pick up, but it's not the thing I think most people have to like end at. Like you said, there's all these other awesome TTRPGs that don't get enough recognition, mostly because they fulfill a much more specific niche. So I've always liked D&D as kind of like the introduction to what TTRPGs could be before maybe moving on to another system that's a little more specific. So, having run so many games in different systems, what's your advice for setting up a successful campaign?
I think one of the things that is like, what is the goal of it and what is the length? I think is really important to figure out. Where you're like, oh, are you going to do 10 hours and be done? Are you going to do 4 weekends and be done? And I work with a bunch of different people through our Patreon where they can do like hour-long calls and I'm helping them plan campaigns with different people, sometimes random people from the internet and stuff like that. And we're starting to see a real success where they're like, rather than sign on for a game and see how it is, it's like, this is the length of campaign I want to run. I want to play Saturdays, and I want to play Saturdays for 3 months. That's the whole game. And it means they don't have as many people dropping from their table because people are like, oh, I've committed to 3 months. Oh, I've committed to 6 months. I'm not committing to eternity. I'm committing to this gap. And then it lets you really design your game to have fun with and support character growth of the players you have in it. Because the more you don't know who's going to be at the table, the more people are plug and play, the more you're losing players and new people are coming in, the more you have to build your story as a DM. Okay, this is the story. This is the mystery. Whoever shows up, this is what's going on. Whereas if you know you're going to have the same players, which is generally my preference, then I can go, oh, this person has a history of being arrested and has an issue with the police. This person has there's like a farmer who's never wanted to get drawn into conflict who's getting drawn into this one. And then I can custom build almost a story where I know it will challenge those characters in fun ways. They will be forced into those beautiful A-B choices where you're like, do you do this or this? And really factor it in and make sure that there are arcs that will favor everybody. So everybody gets to feel a cool thing and it culminates for each of them. And I love looking at that story that way. The other thing is don't over plan and don't expect your characters to do a thing. Depending on your table, I mean, Jesters of Ravenloft is a great example of 4 completely insane comedians who, if I tried to set them up for like a super nearly a novel level gripping emotional experience, we would get 2 episodes in, my novel would be on fire, no one would know what was going to happen, and the show would be chaos. I knew for them to be like, you're in a realm. There's a big bad guy over here. You need to beat these 3 small bad guys to get the cool weapons to go fight the big one. That's pretty much it. I planned the encounters. I planned some weird people they were going to meet. And then they create all their own story. They befriend a skeleton horse. They go into town and try to run for mayor. And one guy eats the person who's like a priest because he's a vampire. And then they do their quests and they're fine. Whereas I've done more, like I ran a Monster of the Week Halloween game. It's called Hack and Slash. It's on our YouTube channel. We did like Dimension 20. It's real pretty. But I was like, oh, for that, I've got these 4 monsters. I know we're getting in and out in 4.5 hours. So, okay, I need the intros for each of these monsters because they all created their own horror movie monsters. Then I was like, each of them is going to have a big rival, so they all get their kind of payoff episode. Oh, this is this person's episode. This is this person's. The whole team's going to help, but they've all got their target, and then they all come together for this ending here. And I think it's more prep for shorter games and more knowledge about the characters for shorter games. And the longer the campaign is, the more you can all feel out exactly what you're doing and what everybody wants.
That's interesting because I think most people would intuit the opposite, where if they were thinking bigger scope, they'd have to prep more. And I've seen a lot of DMs burn themselves out, falling into that trap. But no, you're absolutely right. Just to reiterate, did you say Jesters of Ravenloft was your first time DMing, or had you DM'd before?
That was my first time DMing D&D. I think I had done the second season of our Warhammer 40K show. I had run first. And then it was like that. And then I'd kind of guessed, yeah, but I hadn't really had my own campaign. It was my first Dungeons and Dragons. So it was my first, like, here's a runner, because I'd run the second season of things. Tom, our regular DM, did this thing called Having a Child, which has become very popular with a lot of people I know in their 30s. So he was less available to record podcasts. So for two of our shows, it was like, oh, he's built this world. He's built these characters. I was one of the players. And for the story to continue, it was like, okay, we'll do a spin-off. And I can run that, but it meant I had a lot of the world building already done for me. I was like, oh, I'm bringing over these two established characters. I have a bunch of NPCs. They may be in a new town, but I'm extending the work. It's kind of, I got to do the fan fiction equivalent of starting my own campaign. Jesters was the first one where I was like, there's nobody else here. It's fully built from the ground up. And it was the first time I had run in D&D, figuring out how to do that. And some systems are easier to run in. Vampire the Masquerade is, I would argue, a little bit easier in terms of combat capacity because your characters are vampires, so they're all kind of really hardcore to begin with. And in the rulebook, there are like 15 or 20 NPC stat blocks, and that's it. That's all you got. You want. There's like mean vampire, political vampire, crazy vampire, magic vampire, and I'm like, all right, I could pull those. 4-on-4, let's do a fight. It's vampires. It's really easy to spin up, whereas D&D is a little more with like challenge rating and some of the other things, and depending on your party and depending on how tired they are and how you're going to balance that, and that can be much trickier. I found with that, for me designing the campaigns, I tend to design the whole area that they're in. Ravenloft's nice because you're like, here's a domain. And it means when they start a domain, because I'm panicked, I will sit down and go like, okay, what's this domain? What are the big bad guys? Okay, what are their stats? I went through all the challenge ratings to look at every level 1 creature that existed in all of my books. I made a big spreadsheet, and I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. I had this idea, and I'd make my list. And it took me 3 seasons to nail it down, but this season I figured it out. I went and bought all of the cool creature cards that they sell, where you as a DM can just pull everything you need. And I made a map of the domain, and I took out envelopes for each area, and I put the creature cards in the envelopes for that area, whether it was the townsfolk, whoever the normal NPCs were, whoever the monsters were. And I bought a bunch of these little, like, the miniature sticky notes that I could put on them. And I would just write how many of those creatures was a balanced conflict for the party. Where I was like, 1 orc captain and 3 orcs. And I would have them in there. And it meant when they went to any area in the world, take the envelope out, set the cards out. I was like, if it's combat, it's combat. If it's not, it's not. I can refer to these stats. I'm set. And it meant it means I could plan a day and run a show for 6 months.
It's just really impressive because the production of Jesters of Ravenloft in particular is just so professional. So to think of that as like your first like D&D game that it's been all you running, like, props. That's awesome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I will also acknowledge, and I think it's one of those things where people really compare themselves to other people's games. And I'm like, I am in the weird world of not knowing this was a thing I could do professionally and accidentally training my entire life for exactly this thing. Because it was like, I did acting for a million years. Like, I did acting for almost 10 years, ranging from kids theater to Shakespeare to opera to musical theater. Then I got into voiceover and film and TV acting. Then I got into writing, producing, and directing. Then I spent nearly a decade doing screenwriting, rewriting people's scripts, coaching people on writing, coaching people on how to make their character have the right journey they wanted it to have, the kind of characters who could challenge that character. Trained in improv to be able to just riff things really quickly. Then I spent 5 years writing interactive video games where it's literally walking characters through choices to keep people interested. And then I started DMing. So it was my first go around in some ways, and I'm not saying this to brag. I'm saying this so people don't think like, oh, I have to be perfect right up front. Because I'm like, no. If I had If I did not have all of that work experience, I'd be in a completely different realm. And if I didn't have Tom McGee, one of the best DMs on the planet, being my DM across 4 systems for 4 years before this happened, I'm not starting where I'm starting. I'm standing on the shoulders of dice rolling giants.
Yeah, actually, one of my co-hosts for a different segment, Stephanie, will talk about borrowing brilliance, and how a lot of times when someone makes something look really easy, it's disguising the years and years of repetition, in various disciplines that culminate in this amazing moment.
And the
Um,
absolute panic about it. I still start every session going like, oh God, this is the one where I'm going to tank it all. Like the better it goes for longer, I'm not more confident. I'm more like, oh, I have a streak I'm going to break. Like this episode's going to suck.
just curious, do you play any games casually, or is it only through the podcast still?
Right now, it's only through the podcast because I've roped all of my friends into the podcast at this point. I need more friends is the challenge.
All right, all that being said, if you could go back in time, before even GMing Warhammer for the first time, and give yourself like one piece of advice, it might overlap what you've already said for other GMs setting up a successful campaign. What would you tell yourself? What would be that one piece of advice?
Breathe, relax, feel free to slow down or pause or check the rule book. Nobody cares if you do that. And your players want this to be good and are all working with you to make this good. You're not in a world where it's like, show up and entertain us. They are playing their characters in their head. They are tracking their own rules, which they will often get wrong or not remember. But you don't have to be perfect. There is no perfect game. It's all chaos. At the end, if you walk out feeling secure, you can still look back and go, oh, I could have done that with that NPC and that would have been neat. Oh, that rule, oh, we got that wrong. I'll apologize and we'll fix that next session. Oh, we'll change this moving forwards. I do that all the time now. But I think in the first game, it was like, I have to know all the rules. Everybody has to be able to walk into the room knowing absolutely nothing, sit down. Somehow they're going to know none of the rules and all of the rules. So I have to teach them everything and they will know everything I teach them wrong. And then I also have to run this story and I have to do all of this. And it's every time I sit down and I'm panicked before I start because I feel like it's all on me. And the moment it starts, I'm like, oh yeah, there are 5 of us telling this story. It's not just me. We're all in this together, and nobody's gonna be like, that NPC sucks and you suck. Like that's not what you get told at the table by players. They get excited about weird stuff. Just lean in. If they're having a good time, it's the right thing. If you feel like there's a big grand mystery and you've got the right answer on who the murderer is, and your players come up with an amazing theory that they are absolutely hounding, you realize like, oh no, I accidentally gave them 5 pieces of evidence that are not the important evidence at all. They got caught in a side room, but they found 5 pieces of evidence that said that this guy's got to be the evil Duke who's going to kill everybody. Here's the other trick I'll tell a new DM. On your break, just think about it. Odds are you should probably make that person the evil Duke who's trying to kill everybody. The players already got there. It was rewarding, and they found it based on evidence that you got wrong. And this is the high price. This is the burden the DM will carry until they die. And then every time they will talk about how amazing the mystery was where they found that evil Duke. You do not tell them that was not the bad guy originally and you changed it. You carry that in your heart. That is what you do for them to build those big moments. But I think, yeah, just breathe. If you want to pause and take back a scene, pause and take back a scene. It's a story. It doesn't have to have a flow. Have a good time. Also, you don't have to know the DC for everything. This is like the biggest DM thing in the world, and I'll say this right now. Your players don't know a DC. There's a reason you don't tell them. So, frankly, that you could just be like, roll in athletics. And if the number sounds good, they did it. And if the number doesn't sound good, they didn't do it. They don't know. You don't have to check a book for that.
So now on the other end of the timeline, where you are now, is there anything that you're doing in particular to like level up your game or improve your game mastering ability?
I am in the rare niche where I can listen to the games. I can go listen to the episodes. I do know some of our listeners have started to do that with their own games, or they've started to use an AI thing to create a transcript of their games. I think taking detailed notes is the really big thing, even at the end of the session, which may be the time you don't. Sit there, chat with everybody when they go, but that day, sit down and write down the details you remember and the plot beats you want to pay off right at the end. I'll even do that sitting around the table during our like highlight chats afterwards, where everybody's kind of talking about their favorite moments from everybody else, and I'll be like, oh, actually, this character should actually go here. Oh, this villain would actually be thinking this at this time. Oh, this. That's it. It's getting it written down because it's so easy to lose those. Even the next day, you will forget the small intricacies of what you're doing. And just make it about the players. I think every time I plan and get too stressed, it's because I'm imagining a world where it's just me. And I'm like, no, it's all of us. They're going to contribute a bunch of stuff and you aren't going to know what it is unless you need to. And then also just go ask people, hey, what are you thinking? You said you were going to have a plan the next session that we come in. What are you thinking for that plan? You can absolutely ask that as a DM. And then they're like, oh, I'm going to use this spell and this magic item. And then you get to be like, oh, cool. And then you go home and you're like, I forgot I had the magic item. Oh, God, it's going to break everything. And then you figure out the way to make it work.
So we're about out of time today. Thank you again so much for joining me. Before we go, is there anything specific you'd like to plug? I'm going to be linking your shows in the description of this episode. But are there any other projects you're really excited about or anything you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I mean, we've got our regular shows, obviously, Dum-Dums and Dragons, Canada by Night, Jesters of Ravenloft, and the Valentine Heresy are all running. They all have weekly episodes going out there right now. We've got our Patreon. It's a great place. We got a ton of videos just like this where we talk about our tips, tricks, and traps is what we call them. I don't know why it's impossible to say, and I stumble over it. I'm so glad I said it here. But we have those available. And Jesters of Ravenloft is the one where if you want to see all the madness live, I take my 4 crazy improviser comedians, and we record every Wednesday night on Twitch at Dum Dum Dice, because it's the company name. So if you want to see this in action, you can watch the weirdest people who absolutely are unconsciously breaking everything you've ever seen about the. It's been like 120 episodes, and they can't even remember how their spells work. But like we are having a time, and you can see it live, so you can see my brain melt on screen every Wednesday night. But that's particularly fun.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you again for joining me. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragon Mind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Thesleyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at thesleyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.